What if the most famous story about the Anunnaki has the wrong ending? For decades, people have repeated a fascinating claim that ancient Sumerian tablets reveal humanity was not created by the Anunnaki at all. According to the story, humans were already living in Mesopotamia when these mysterious beings arrived. They didn't create humanity. They simply found us, took control, and later claimed they had made us. It sounds like the kind of discovery that could rewrite human history. But there is a problem. When you follow the claim back to the actual cuneiform evidence, something strange happens. The famous tablet supposedly proving this story becomes almost impossible to find. And that leads to a much more interesting question. If the evidence isn't where the story says it is, then why has the story become so convincing? To answer that, we have to go back thousands of years, to a world where gods were not distant ideas. They were rulers. They had cities. They had temples. They had rivalries. And according to the stories written by Mesopotamian scribes, they had a problem: work. The ancient Mesopotamian creation traditions do not begin with modern ideas about extraterrestrials. They begin with something much more human: labor. In the Atrahasis tradition, the gods themselves are forced to work. They dig canals. They maintain the land. They carry the burden of civilization. And eventually, the labor becomes too much. The lesser gods rebel. Their tools are abandoned. The system begins to collapse. And this is where humanity enters the story. Not as an accidental discovery, not as an alien experiment, but as a solution to a divine labor crisis. The god Enki, known as Ea in later Akkadian traditions, becomes central to the plan. Human beings are created so that they can carry the workload. The ancient story is remarkably direct about the purpose. Humanity exists to perform work that the gods no longer want to perform themselves. That detail matters, because it completely changes the popular image of the Anunnaki. In modern internet culture, the Anunnaki are often presented as mysterious visitors who arrived from somewhere beyond Earth. But in the actual Mesopotamian texts, they belong to a complicated divine hierarchy. They are gods within a religious system, and that system is obsessed with order. Who rules? Who works? Who receives offerings? Who has authority? Who owes something to whom? The creation of humanity is therefore not simply a story about where humans came from. It is also a story about why humans have a place in the cosmic order. And then the story becomes even stranger, because humanity eventually becomes too numerous, too noisy. The gods become disturbed by the sound of human civilization, and one god decides that something must be done. That decision eventually leads to one of the most famous flood stories ever recorded. Long before the biblical story of Noah was written down, Mesopotamian scribes were already preserving stories about a devastating flood. Atrahasis is warned. A boat is constructed. The flood comes. Humanity survives. And once again, Enki becomes the god who protects humanity from destruction. This is important because it reveals something that the modern Anunnaki narrative often leaves out. The ancient stories are not one simple story. They are a collection of traditions written, copied, modified, and preserved over enormous periods of time. There is no single Sumerian book called the Anunnaki story. There is no ancient equivalent of a modern science fiction encyclopedia explaining exactly who the Anunnaki were. Instead, there are myths, hymns, literary compositions, administrative texts, royal inscriptions, and fragments. Some are centuries apart. Some were copied long after their original composition. Some tell completely different stories about the same gods. That means when someone says, "The Sumerians said the Anunnaki did this," the obvious question should be, which tablet? Which text? Which period? Which language? Which translation? And most importantly, where is the original evidence? This is where the famous "they found us first" story begins to fall apart. There are genuine tablets from Nippur. There are genuine Sumerian creation texts. There are genuine traditions involving Enki, Ninmah, Enlil, the Anunnaki, and the creation of humans. Penn Museum, for example, holds an actual Nippur tablet cataloged as a creation of man text, associated with the Enki and Ninmah tradition. There are also genuine Atrahasis manuscripts describing humans being created to relieve the gods of their labor. But the supposed Philadelphia tablet containing the unmistakable declaration that humans were already there when the Anunnaki arrived? That is where extraordinary caution becomes necessary, because the dramatic quotations circulated online are not supported by the standard scholarly evidence in the way the stories suggest. And that doesn't make the subject boring. It makes it more interesting, because there really is a mystery here. Not the mystery of a hidden alien tablet. The mystery is how an ancient religious tradition became transformed into a modern story about extraterrestrial intervention. The answer begins with translation. Cuneiform is not a simple code where one symbol always equals one English word. Signs can have different readings. Words can have different meanings depending on context. Languages change. Sumerian is not Akkadian. Akkadian is not Hebrew, and neither is equivalent to modern English. When thousands of years separate the original writer from the modern reader, interpretation becomes unavoidable. Then something else happens. Ancient gods begin getting translated into modern categories. A divine being becomes an alien. A heavenly realm becomes outer space. A divine descent becomes an arrival from another planet. A mythological conflict becomes a technological event. And suddenly a religious story begins to look like a science fiction report. But there is a deeper reason the Anunnaki story is so powerful. It solves a modern obsession. Where did humanity come from? Why are we here? Why did civilization appear? Why did ancient people build enormous temples? Why did different cultures develop complicated religions? And could someone have helped humanity become civilized? Those questions are real, but a fascinating question does not automatically make a particular answer true. The ancient evidence tells us something more complicated. The people of Mesopotamia were already capable of extraordinary achievements. They developed one of the world's earliest writing systems. They built cities. They organized agriculture. They created complex administrative systems. They recorded trade. They developed mathematics. They observed the sky. And they created stories to explain the forces they could not control. The gods in those stories reflected the structure of their own society. There were rulers, workers, temples, taxes, conflicts, natural disasters, and obligations. So when the Mesopotamians imagined the gods creating humanity to perform labor, they were not necessarily describing an experiment. They may have been explaining their own world. Human beings worked because everyone worked. Kings ruled because someone had to rule. Temples received offerings because temples organized society. The gods were placed at the top of that structure because religion gave the structure cosmic meaning. And this is where the title of our story becomes almost true, but in a completely different way. Did the Anunnaki take credit for humanity? Not in the literal historical sense, but ancient religious traditions absolutely could assign the gods responsibility for humanity's existence. And once a civilization accepts that idea, the story becomes more than mythology. It becomes an explanation of human purpose. You exist because the gods wanted you to exist. You work because the gods require your work. You sacrifice because the gods deserve offerings. You obey because the universe itself is organized around divine authority. That is a powerful idea, and it explains why creation myths mattered so much. But there is still one question. Why do some modern versions insist that the Anunnaki were not gods at all? Why turn them into extraterrestrials? Part of the answer comes from the 20th century, when ancient astronaut theories became popular. Writers began looking at ancient descriptions of gods, strange objects, heavenly journeys, and monumental architecture through the lens of modern technology. A flying object became a spacecraft. A god descending from heaven became an astronaut. A mysterious divine weapon became advanced technology. The interpretation was exciting, but excitement is not evidence. And the biggest problem is that the ancient texts themselves do not require this interpretation. They already have their own framework. The gods belong to a supernatural world. Their powers are mythological. Their relationships are political. Their actions are symbolic. And their stories often contradict one another. That last part is important. If you collect every Mesopotamian myth and expect them to form one perfectly consistent history, you will inevitably have to invent connections that the ancient scribes themselves never made. One text may emphasize Enki, another may emphasize Enlil, another may focus on a particular city, another may explain humanity through a completely different tradition. That isn't evidence of a hidden conspiracy. It is what happens when a civilization preserves stories across centuries. And yet, something about these stories remains genuinely unsettling. The ancient Mesopotamians really did imagine humanity as part of a divine system of labor. They really did imagine gods becoming frustrated with humans. They really did imagine a flood powerful enough to nearly erase civilization. They really did preserve stories in which one god saves humanity while another wants humanity destroyed. And they really did write all of this into clay thousands of years ago. No alien explanation is required to make that fascinating. In fact, the real story may be stranger. Because imagine living in the world's first cities. You have no modern science, no satellites, no geology textbooks, no written history stretching back thousands of years. You look at the rivers, you watch the floods, you watch the stars, you see disease destroy families, you see drought destroy crops, you build walls against enemies, and then you ask the most basic question imaginable: why are we here? The answer becomes a story, and that story is pressed into wet clay. The clay dries, the city disappears, the language dies, the kingdoms collapse, the temples fall. Thousands of years pass, and eventually, someone digs the tablet out of the ground. That is the truly extraordinary part. Not that aliens might have visited Earth, but that human beings living thousands of years ago were already asking the same enormous questions we are still asking today. Where did we come from? Why do we suffer? Why do we work? Why do the gods remain silent? And what happens when the people who believe they understand the universe discover that they may have misunderstood it? So, did the Anunnaki find humanity and take credit for creating us? The surviving evidence does not establish that. The famous Forbidden Tablet story should not be presented as established archaeology, but the real Sumerian material gives us something far more valuable. It gives us a window into one of humanity's earliest attempts to explain itself. And perhaps that is the final twist. The mystery was never that the ancient Sumerians secretly knew aliens created civilization. The mystery is that they didn't need aliens to create one of the most sophisticated origin stories the ancient world had ever seen. They looked at humanity. They looked at the gods. They looked at work, power, disaster, survival, and death. Then they pressed their questions into clay. And somehow, thousands of years later, we're still reading them. Maybe the most important question isn't whether the Anunnaki created us. Maybe it's why we are still searching ancient ruins for someone else to blame or thank for being here. Because if those tablets teach us anything, it is this: civilizations disappear. Kings are forgotten. Temples collapse. But the questions human beings ask about themselves can survive almost anything, even 4,000 years of silence.